The first objection Lord Peter Wimsey made to the corpse was grammatical. "A man may be found dead in a library," he observed, bending with delicate interest over the late Mr. Septimus Vane, "or murdered in a library. But to say that he was found murdered is to confuse a condition with an event. One might as well be found christened." Detective Inspector Merbles, who had driven through 9 miles of February rain and eaten no breakfast, regarded him without affection. "He's dead, my lord." "So he is. English prose will survive him, though by the look of his correspondence it has had a narrow escape." The White House stood above St. Olave's village on a chalk ridge overlooking the winter sea. It was not white, except in the legal documents of 1783, when an optimistic owner had described its gray stucco as of the purest classical complexion. Since then, salt, rain, and several generations of veins had reduced it to the color of cold porridge. The room in which Septimus Vane had died was called the Venetian Library because it contained one badly cracked mirror, purchased in Venice, and no books written in Italian. Its windows faced east, towards the square Norman tower of St. Olave's Church, half a mile below. Between house and village lay a sloping lawn, an avenue of yews and a neglected burial ground, in which the Vane family had, for 2 centuries, rested with considerably greater harmony than they had ever displayed while alive. Mr. Vane sat upright in a high-backed chair beside the cold fireplace. His dinner jacket was properly buttoned. His silver hair was brushed. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair. His left clutched a small brass key. There was no wound upon him. There was, however, a faint black crescent beneath his lower lip, as though he had kissed the rim of a dirty cup. On the carpet at his feet stood an empty glass. "And the doctor says poison?" asked Wimsey. "Possibly. Dr. Latham won't commit himself till after the post-mortem." "Doctors," said Wimsey, "have the professional advantage of being uncertain in Latin." He straightened and looked about him. The doors were locked from within when the body was discovered. The windows had been fastened. The chimney was too narrow to admit anything broader than a determined cat, and the ashes showed no recent fire. No glass, bottle, or medicine stood within reach of the dead man. The key in his hand did not belong to either door. It was, Inspector Merbles had already discovered, the key to a small iron box kept in the estate office. The box was empty. At 10 minutes past 11 the previous night, Mr. Vane's niece, Miss Honoria Vale, had knocked at the library door after receiving no answer to her telephone call from the upstairs sitting room. At 11:30, the butler, the housekeeper, and Mr. Vane's nephew had joined her. At 11:42, the nephew had forced the door. Mr. Vane had been dead for approximately an hour. "So far," said Merbles, "we've got a locked room, an empty strongbox, and a family that disliked him. A remarkably economical household. Most families require 3 rooms and a solicitor to accomplish as much." The inspector glanced towards the door. "They're waiting in the morning room." "Then let 'em wait. Grief improves by standing. Like a soufflé." Wimsey crossed to the eastern window. Rain had weakened to a thin, drifting mist, through which the church tower appeared and vanished like a disapproving ghost. The clock face was visible between the bare branches of the yews. It showed 20 minutes past 9. Wimsey took out his watch. It was 3 minutes to 10. "Church clock slow?" he asked. "Stopped," said Merbles. "Lightning struck the mechanism last week." "Ah, it's of no importance. Then we may safely attend to it. Important things are so often misleading," the inspector grunted. From below came the muffled striking of a clock. 10 deliberate strokes, followed after a pause by a thin metallic ting. Wimsey turned his head. What was that? The hall clock. No, after it. Merbles listened. The sound had gone. Servant's bell, perhaps? Perhaps. Bells are the most indiscreet objects in a respectable house. They announce everything except the truth. He examined the window catch without touching it. A gray thread was caught beneath the brass tongue. He bent, peered at it, and smiled in a manner Inspector Merbles had learned to distrust. What? Curtain lining. So? Nothing. Nothing at all. That is why it is pleasant. The door opened and a tall, hollow-chested man entered without knocking. His face possessed the heavy, bruised dignity of a badly carved saint. He wore black gloves indoors and carried himself with the rigid discomfort of one who had spent 40 years listening at doors and resenting what he heard. "This is Baines, the butler," said Merbles. "I beg pardon, sir," said Baines, contriving to suggest that pardon was neither expected nor deserved. "Miss Vale wishes to know how much longer she is to be detained." "Until we know whether she poisoned her uncle," replied the inspector. Baines received this with the somber satisfaction of a man whose private opinion had at last become official. "Very good, sir. Did Mr. Vane drink anything after dinner?" "1 glass of port, sir. I placed the decanter and glass on the library table at 9:25. "This glass?" Wimsey indicated the empty one upon the carpet. Baines looked at it. "No, my lord." Merbles became attentive. "You're sure?" "Quite sure, sir. The port glass had the Vane crest engraved upon it." "That is a plain water glass." "And where is the port glass?" "I do not know, sir." "Nor the decanter?" "No, sir." "When did you last see Mr. Vane alive?" "At 5 minutes to 10. He rang for me and instructed me that he was not to be disturbed." "Which bell did he use?" asked Wimsey. "The library bell, my lord." "Where does it ring?" "In the servants' passage." "Once or continuously?" Baines's expression altered by a degree too small to be called surprise. "Once, my lord." "Curious. I see nothing curious in it." "No? I generally find certainty curious." Wimsey moved towards the fireplace. Above it hung a portrait of a narrow-faced woman in 18th century mourning. Her pale fingers rested upon a sealed document, while behind her an artistically arranged thunderstorm threatened a miniature version of St. Olave's church. "Who is the lady?" "Lady Agnes Vane," said Baines. "She founded the parish almshouses." "And the document?" "Her will, my lord." "Families do like to paint their quarrels before they begin." Baines drew himself up. "There has been no quarrel concerning Mr. Vane's will." Inspector Merbles looked sharply at him. "No one mentioned a will." For the first time, the butler's composure cracked. His gloved fingers closed upon one another. "I assumed, sir, that the empty deed box—" "What was kept in it?" "I could not say." "You could," said Wimsey pleasantly. "You merely prefer the conditional mood." Baines's eyes moved towards the dead man. "Mr. Vane made a new will yesterday afternoon." The rain whispered against the windows. "Who witnessed it?" asked Merbles. "I did, sir. And Mrs. Pavey, the housekeeper." "Who benefits?" "I was not informed." "Who drew it up?" "Mr. Vane drew it himself." Wimsey looked again at the brass key in the corpse's clenched hand. "And the document was placed in the iron box?" "Yes, my lord." "By Mr. Vane?" "Yes." "When?" "At 6 o'clock. Yet the box is now empty." Baines said nothing. From the village below came the sudden clamor of St. Olave's bells. They rang wildly and without rhythm. 6, perhaps 7 blows, then ceased. Inspector Merbles went to the window. "I thought the church mechanism was damaged." "So did everybody," said Wimsey. He remained very still, gazing not at the tower, but at the stopped clock face. Then he crossed the room and examined the dead man's polished shoes. A smear of pale green wax marked the inside edge of the left heel. "Inspector," he said, "when a respectable gentleman dies alone in a locked library, one is tempted to ask who entered the room. Naturally. Quite the wrong question." "What should we ask?" Wimsey glanced at the silent bell pull beside the fireplace, the strand of gray curtain lining caught in the window latch, and the empty space upon the desk, where a decanter ought to have stood. "We should ask," he said softly, "where Mr. Vane went after he was dead." By luncheon, the White House had acquired that peculiar hush which descends upon English families when murder has made conversation socially difficult. Honoria Vale sat beside the drawing-room fire, erect and colorless, while her cousin Julian prowled between the windows with the air of a man rehearsing innocence. Wimsey accepted coffee and declined sympathy. "You telephoned your uncle at 10:45? He asked. "At 10:40, said Honoria. "The exchange clock struck while I waited." "And no answer?" "None." Julian stopped pacing. "Because he was dead." "Possibly. Death is one explanation for silence, though not invariably the most convenient." Honoria's fingers tightened around her cup. "You think he left the library?" "I think somebody wished us to believe he never did." Inspector Murbles entered carrying a folded sheet. "Post-mortem preliminaries. Cyanide. Taken in liquid. Probably between 10 and 10:15. Julian gave a short laugh. "Then that settles it." "He drank the port. Except that the port is missing," said Wimsey. "And the glass beside him contained only water." Murbles laid another object on the table. A small silver button, tarnished black at the rim. "Found beneath the library carpet. Baines, summoned from the doorway, identified it at once. It belonged to the livery worn by Thomas Cray, the under-footman, dismissed 3 weeks earlier for theft." Julian seized upon the fact greedily. Cray had threatened Septimus. Cray knew the house. Cray had once served at St. Olave's church and understood its bells. "Beautiful," murmured Wimsey. "So complete. One distrusts perfection in servants and evidence." Cray was brought in before 3 o'clock, wet, sullen, and smelling faintly of paraffin. He admitted entering the grounds the previous evening, but swore he had come only to meet Elsie Marr, the parlour-maid. "Where?" asked Murbles. "In the old burial ground." "At what time?" 10 o'clock. "And the bell?" Cray looked frightened. "I heard it ring once. Not from the church. From under the ground." Murbles frowned. "There's a passage," Cray continued. "Old service tunnel from the house chapel to the Vane vault. Mr. Septimus had it opened last month." Honoria's cup slipped against its saucer. Wimsey turned to her. "You knew?" "No." "You lie very prettily," he said. "One sees the family resemblance." By dusk, they stood inside the Vane mausoleum, where damp effigies watched from niches, and the air tasted of stone. Behind a loosened panel lay a narrow stair descending into darkness. At its foot, Murbles found the missing port decanter. Wimsey found something better, a strip of gray curtain lining, tied carefully around a bell wire. He touched it, listened to the faint answering chime somewhere above, and smiled. "Our dead man," he said, "had an appointment underground." Beside the decanter lay a broken sealing-wax stick, pale green and impressed with a woman's signet. Honoria stared at it, then at her own bare right hand. "I lost the ring yesterday," she whispered. "No," said Wimsey. "You removed it." "Losing things is accidental. Concealment generally requires a motive, and occasionally a very good memory indeed." Honoria's denial arrived too quickly. "I concealed nothing. The ring loosened last week. I put it in my jewel case." "Then your jewel case has developed a taste for subterranean architecture," said Wimsey. Murbles lifted the wax with his handkerchief. The impression, though broken, showed half a winged stag, the veil crest. Honoria looked from it to Julian, whose face had assumed the unhealthy brightness of a man witnessing someone else's catastrophe. "She was here," he said. "I saw her leave the drawing room before 10. "You saw a door close," replied Honoria. "That is not the same thing." Wimsey raised his lamp toward the tunnel roof. A narrow groove ran through the dust, ending beneath a pulley fixed to an iron bracket. The bell wire had been threaded through it and attached to a small sandbag resting behind the stone panel. "A delayed summons," he murmured. "Cut the cord, let the weight fall, and the servants hear the library bell after its owner has gone elsewhere." Murbles examined the arrangement. "But who cut it?" "Nobody. Damp did the work. The cord was sugar thread, strengthened with gum. Moisture dissolved it at an uncertain but useful interval." "Useful to whom?" "To anyone requiring Mr. Vane to appear alive at 5 minutes to 10. They searched the passage carefully. Near the bottom stair lay scratches in the mortar and a faint scattering of white powder. Wimsey tasted none of it, to Murbles's visible relief, but collected it in an envelope. "Plaster," Julian said. "Chalk," said Wimsey. "Our countryside is composed of it, but our mausoleum is not. The tunnel ended behind a cupboard in the disused chapel, a room shut since the death of Septimus's wife. Its altar was sheeted, its prayer books mildewed, and upon the floor stood a pair of muddy galoshes. Baines identified them as his masters. Honoria whispered, "He came through here." "And returned," said Murbles. "There's mud on both sides." "No," Wimsey answered. "One pair of boots may make 2 journeys without 1 pair of feet." He knelt beside the galoshes. Inside the left boot was a smear of green wax. Inside the right, a curl of coarse red hair. Julian instinctively touched his own dark head. "Cray is red-haired," he said. "Conveniently," said Wimsey. From the chapel window they could see St. Olave's tower. At that moment, the stopped hands moved backwards by 1 minute. Honoria cried out. Wimsey watched without surprise. "Not supernatural," he said. "Merely mechanical, and very expensive." Behind them, the cupboard door swung shut. A key turned in the lock. Then, from the tunnel, came the slow scrape of approaching footsteps. Murbles extinguished his lamp. Wimsey did not. He stepped aside and drew Honoria behind the altar. The footsteps halted beyond the panel. A voice, muffled by stone, said, "Mr. Vane?" No one answered. The panel opened 3 inches. A hand appeared, holding not a pistol, but a silver salver. Upon it lay the missing port glass, its engraved crest gleaming wetly in the lamplight. The hand remained motionless, pale against the silver. Murbles sprang forward and seized the wrist. There followed a strangled cry, a clatter of metal, and the appearance of Mrs. Pavey, the housekeeper, drawn through the opening with considerably less dignity than she had maintained during 30 years of service. "You," said Honoria. Mrs. Pavey recovered herself and glared at Murbles. "If gentlemen choose to lurk in cupboards, sir, they must expect misunderstandings." Wimsey picked up the glass. Its rim was wet, though no rain had entered the chapel. He sniffed it, touched 1 finger to the bowl, and examined the moisture beneath the lamp. "Warm water," he said. "How domestic." Mrs. Pavey folded her hands. "I was told to bring it." "By whom?" asked Murbles. "A note was left on my tray." She produced a scrap of paper. In a cramped hand were the words, "Place the crested glass upon the chapel salver at 4 precisely. Say nothing." Julian laughed sharply. "My uncle's writing." "No," said Honoria. "It resembles it." "Imitation," murmured Wimsey, "is admiration conducted with a penknife." He held the note beside a memorandum found in Septimus's pocket. The capital letters were convincing, but the lower loops leaned left instead of right. "Who knew Mrs. Pavey used this passage?" asked Murbles. "Nobody," she replied. "Except Mr. Vane, and whoever watched you oil the cupboard hinges," said Wimsey. Mrs. Pavey's eyes flickered. The sound of the locking key had come not from the chapel door, but from the panel mechanism. Someone had turned it from within the tunnel and withdrawn before Murbles reached the opening. The footsteps, therefore, had been genuine. The voice had been disguised. They searched the passage again. Halfway to the mausoleum, Wimsey stopped beside a shallow niche. A faint odor of lavender hung there. On the floor lay a shred of black silk and 1 grain of white powder. "Chalk again," said Murbles. "No, face powder." Honoria touched her cheek involuntarily. Julian saw it. "You came here." "So did someone wearing gloves," she answered. "You own black ones." "Everyone owns black gloves in February. Not everyone scents them with lavender." Baines, waiting above, was summoned. His gloves, when examined, smelled of carbolic soap. Mrs. Pavey's smelled of starch. Honoria wore none. Wimsey asked for Elsie Marr. The parlor-maid arrived trembling. Her hair was red beneath its cap, and one side had been roughly cut near the ear. Cray's secret meeting, it appeared, had not been romantic. Elsie had summoned him because she had seen Septimus crossing the burial ground at 9:40, accompanied by a veiled woman. "Who?" demanded Murbles. Elsie looked at Honoria. Then she pointed past her. "To the portrait," she whispered. The dead Lady Agnes walked beside him. Nobody spoke. Wimsey alone examined the portrait's painted mourning dress. Dead ladies, he observed, are commonly recognized by their clothes. Living ones rely upon their faces. He lifted the fallen salver. Scratched beneath it were two fresh words. Remember Albion. Honoria went suddenly white. Honoria's color returned in two uneven patches. Albion means nothing to me. Then it has chosen an unfortunate moment to become memorable, said Wimsey. Julian had ceased smiling. Mrs. Pavey crossed herself before remembering that Anglican housekeeping discouraged theatrical gestures. Murbles turned the salver over. Could Vane have scratched it? With what? Asked Wimsey. His fingernails were clean, his pockets contained no knife, and the lettering was made after the silver had been polished. Observe the burr. He traced the final stroke without touching it. The letters were crude, but the downward cuts all leaned at the same angle. Written by a left-handed person, said Honoria. Engraved by someone standing sideways, replied Wimsey. The distinction may preserve an innocent person from arrest. Inspector Murbles gave him a look which suggested that preserving innocent persons was an inconvenient luxury. Back in the morning room, Septimus Vane's solicitor, Mr. Harcourt Bligh, arrived from London. He was small, pink, and composed almost entirely of discretion. He confirmed that Albion had been the name of a private asylum near Bath, closed 15 years earlier after allegations of cruelty. Mr. Vane was connected with it? Asked Murbles. Financially, said Bligh. He was one of 3 trustees. And the others? One is dead. The second was Dr. Adrian Vale, Miss Vale's father. Honoria stood. My father died abroad. So you were told, said Bligh. The room contracted around her. Bligh explained that Adrian Vale had not died in Switzerland. He had suffered a breakdown after accusing the Albion directors of imprisoning sane patients for profit. Septimus had signed the order committing him under another name. Adrian remained there until a fire destroyed part of the institution. No body was formally identified. You knew? Honoria asked Julian. No, but the answer came half a second late. Wimsey wandered to the mantelpiece and adjusted a porcelain shepherd by 1 inch. Truth, he remarked, is often late because it must dress for dinner. Bligh produced a sealed copy of Septimus's former will. The estate had been divided equally between Honoria and Julian. The new will, now missing, was believed to reverse that arrangement, though Bligh had not seen it. Reverse it how? Asked Murbles. Everything to one, nothing to the other. Julian's hands tightened. A servant entered with news from the church. The verger had found the clock mechanism altered. Its hands could be moved from the White House by an old electrical cable laid during the war. And the bells? Asked Wimsey. Controlled by the same circuit, my lord. Wimsey looked towards Honoria. Your father was an electrical engineer, was he not? Yes. Then somebody has been studying the dead. At that instant, the telephone rang. Murbles answered. His face hardened. Thomas Cray had been found unconscious beside the church switchboard, clutching the missing will. Across its first page, in green wax, was impressed the seal of Albion, and beneath the seal, written in Septimus Vane's unmistakable hand, appeared a single sentence. Honoria Vale is not my brother's daughter. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Honoria laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It possessed none of Julian's brittle amusement, but came from somewhere deeper, where humiliation had been stored too long. My uncle always preferred cruelty in writing, she said. Bligh examined the page. The hand is certainly his. The paper? Asked Wimsey. His private stock. The ink? Bligh hesitated. That I cannot determine. Then certainty has already mislaid its hat. Murbles left immediately for the church. Wimsey remained, studying the will without touching it. The document bequeathed everything to Julian, described Honoria as the child of an adulterous liaison, and revoked all previous provisions. The signatures of Baines and Mrs. Pavey appeared correctly beneath it. You witnessed this? Wimsey asked. Baines inclined his head. Did you read it? No, my lord, Mrs. Pavey answered likewise. Did Mr. Vane fold it before you signed? Yes, said Baines. No, said Mrs. Pavey. They looked at each other. Wimsey smiled faintly. Domestic unanimity is always touching until details arrive. He asked each witness to demonstrate the signing. Baines placed an imaginary document flat upon the desk. Mrs. Pavey folded hers lengthwise before indicating the signature line. The paper was folded, she insisted. I remember, because the edge cut my thumb. She showed a healing nick. Wimsey lifted the will toward the window. No crease ran through it. Julian swore softly. So this is not the document witnessed yesterday, said Honoria. It may still be the document your uncle intended, replied Bligh. Intention, said Wimsey, is the refuge of documents with poor alibis. At St. Olave's, Cray recovered enough to speak. He claimed a veiled woman had summoned him by note and ordered him to repair the clock circuit. When he refused, someone struck him from behind. He remembered lavender and the scrape of a metal heel. Murbles searched his pockets and found a small screwdriver marked with Julian's initials. Julian protested that it had vanished from the gunroom weeks ago. Things vanish frequently in this house, said Wimsey. Wills, glasses, fathers, reputations. One begins to suspect organization. He requested Honoria's jewel case. Her signet ring lay inside, exactly where she had claimed. Yet when pressed into soft wax, its winged stag faced left. The seal on the will faced right. A copy, said Murbles. A mirror copy, corrected Wimsey. He returned to the portrait of Lady Agnes. In the cracked Venetian mirror opposite, her painted seal reversed itself. Wimsey's gaze sharpened. Behind the portrait, they found a shallow recess containing black silk, lavender scent, chalk, red hair, and a second pair of galoshes. At the bottom lay a photograph of Adrian Vale, taken only 6 months earlier. On its back was written, "Your father is alive. Ask who buried him." Honoria gripped the mantelpiece. Where was this taken? Bligh leaned closer. That building is the Albion Laundry. Wimsey turned the photograph sideways. In its glossy surface, a window reflected the White House library. No, he said, it was taken here. The photograph passed from hand to hand, acquiring suspicion with every transfer. The Albion Laundry was demolished 12 years ago, said Bligh. Buildings are often demolished, replied Wimsey. Their windows are less obliging about traveling. He placed the photograph beside the Venetian mirror. The reflected library window showed the same cracked upper pane and the same crooked U beyond it. Someone had dressed a corner of the White House to resemble the asylum. Honoria stared at the picture. Then my father may not be alive. Or may be alive and photographed elsewhere. False scenery does not necessarily imply a false actor. Murbles returned from the church carrying Cray's statement and an expression of official irritation. The fellow says the woman who struck him limped. Which leg? He cannot remember. Then he remembers a sound, not a limp. Wimsey asked the household to walk across the library one by one. Julian's shoes were soft-soled. Honoria's heels clicked evenly. Mrs. Pavey shuffled. Baines moved almost noiselessly. Bligh's right shoe gave a faint metallic scrape. Everyone looked at him. The solicitor reddened. Steel support, childhood injury. Excellent, said Wimsey. A perfectly innocent explanation, which is naturally what makes it dangerous. Bligh removed the shoe. The support was old, but a smear of green wax clung near the heel. He protested that he had stepped upon sealing wax during the signing. Mrs. Pavey shook her head. There was no green wax in the estate office. Mr. Vane used red. Wimsey's eyes brightened. He requested the old account books of Albion. They were brought from the estate room in 3 damp volumes. Among payments to doctors and suppliers appeared repeated sums to A. White, listed as consultant in electrical security. White, murmured Honoria. The White House. No, said Wimsey. Names are rarely so considerate. Continue. The final volume revealed that A. White had been paid for acoustic partitions, remote bell circuits, and observation chambers. The initials ceased after the asylum fire. A folded receipt slipped from the binding. It bore Adrian Vale's signature. Honoria closed her eyes. "He built the mechanism," said Murbles. "He designed it," corrected Wimsey. "Builders leave invoices. Designers leave temptations." That evening, the household gathered for dinner under police supervision. One place remained empty. Baines had vanished. His black gloves were found beside the chapel cupboard. In the right glove lay a key to the church switchboard. In the left, a human tooth. Dr. Latham examined it. "Recently extracted," he said. From a living adult, a cry sounded from the corridor. They found Baines in the portrait gallery, conscious but unable to speak. Blood darkened his mouth, and one front tooth was missing. Pinned to his coat was a card bearing 3 words: "He remembers everything." Wimsey read it twice. Then he looked at the portraits, not at Baines. "Inspector," he said quietly, "we have been assuming the message is about Adrian Vale. And it isn't? No. It is about the man who served him before the fire at Albion." Baines was carried to his room, where Dr. Latham declared the injury painful but not dangerous. The butler, deprived of speech and dignity together, communicated by writing upon a slate. Wimsey asked one question: "Were you employed at Albion?" Baines stared at him, then wrote, "Under another name." "Which?" asked Murbles. The chalk squeaked. "Abel White." Honoria drew back. "The electrical consultant." Chapter 10. 500 words without heading or subtitle. Baines shook his head violently and added, "His assistant." According to the halting account that followed, Adrian Vale had designed Albion's concealed speaking tubes, observation panels, and remote bells, after being assured they were intended to protect violent patients. When he discovered that the devices were being used to spy upon sane inmates and fabricate evidence of madness, he threatened exposure. Septimus arranged his confinement. Baines, then a junior attendant named Abel White, helped Adrian escape during the fire. "And afterward?" asked Wimsey. Baines wrote, "I lost him." "Yet somebody found him," said Wimsey, glancing at the false photograph. The butler's slate trembled. "He came here 3 months ago." Honoria made a sound like a breath breaking. Baines explained that Adrian had returned old, scarred, and obsessed with forcing Septimus to confess publicly. He refused to see Honoria until his name was cleared. Baines hid him in the disused gardener's cottage and carried messages between the brothers. "Was Adrian here last night?" asked Murbles. Baines hesitated, then wrote, "Yes." "Did he kill Septimus?" The chalk snapped. Before Baines could answer, Wimsey took the slate away. "You have mistaken the order, Inspector. Ask where Adrian was at 10 o'clock. Baines wrote slowly. "In the church tower. The remote clock circuit had been his proof. Adrian intended to make the stopped hands move while confronting Septimus, demonstrating that the old mechanism still worked, and that Albion's records could be reconstructed. The church bells were to ring at 10 as a signal, but they did not ring until this morning," said Murbles. Baines nodded. "So, someone interrupted the circuit," said Wimsey, "and later restored it to frighten us." He then asked why Baines's tooth had been taken. The butler wrote, "Identification." In Albion, bodies burned beyond recognition had been identified from dental charts. One corpse had been recorded as Adrian Vale because Baines had secretly exchanged the charts, allowing Adrian to disappear. "Who knew?" asked Honoria. Baines pointed toward the door. Julian stood there. For once, his expression held no amusement. "My mother knew," he said. "She was Septimus's secretary at Albion." Wimsey regarded him with almost tender interest. "And inherited her papers?" "Yes." "Including the true dental records?" Julian's silence answered. Murbles moved toward him, but Wimsey raised a hand. "Not yet. Mr. Vale is concealing something, but concealment is not murder. Besides, our killer is vain." "Vain?" "He has arranged clocks, portraits, bells, costumes, handwriting, and ancestral scandal. Such a person does not merely wish to escape. He wishes to be understood." Wimsey looked at the silent library bell. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we shall oblige him at last." At 9 the following evening, the Venetian library was arranged exactly as it had been before Septimus Vane's death. The crested glass stood upon the table. The port decanter, recovered from the tunnel, had been filled with colored water. Curtains were drawn, the library bell connected, and the stopped face of St. Olave's clock watched through the eastern window. Wimsey placed each person carefully. Honoria sat beside the fire. Julian stood near the portrait. Baines, pale and bandaged, waited by the door. Mrs. Pavey and Bligh occupied the shadowed wall. Murbles concealed himself inside the chapel passage with 2 constables. An amateur murder, said Wimsey, usually fails because the murderer imitates effect rather than cause. Tonight, we shall reverse the process. At 9:25, Baines carried in the decanter. At 9:40, the library lamp was lowered. At 9:55, the bell rang once. Nobody had touched it. Mrs. Pavey gasped. Wimsey lifted the gray cord running behind the curtain. Sugar thread again. Prepared this afternoon by the same hand that prepared it before. Julian stared. You allowed someone to tamper with the room? I invited it. Outside, St. Olave's clock began to move. The hands slid backwards, paused at 10, then advanced rapidly to 11. At once, the portrait of Lady Agnes swung outward. A veiled figure stepped through the recess, carrying a silver salver and wearing the mourning dress from the painting. Honoria rose, but Wimsey held her back. The figure placed the salver down and spoke in a hollow voice. Septimus Vane, remember Albion. Then the lights failed. In the darkness came the sound of breaking glass, a cry, and the sharp metallic scrape of a heel. Murbles rushed from the passage. A constable relit the lamps. Bligh lay beside the desk, clutching his throat. The veiled figure had vanished. On the carpet stood the broken crested glass. Cyanide! Cried Dr. Latham from the doorway. No, said Wimsey. Bitter almonds from essence, and theatrical choking from a solicitor who has missed his vocation. Bligh's convulsions ceased. Murbles hauled him upright. Beneath his coat he wore the black morning gown. The veil had been thrown behind the desk. A small battery and wire spool filled his pockets. Honoria looked sick. You staged all of it? Bligh smiled faintly. You cannot prove murder. Not yet, said Wimsey, but you have kindly proved machinery. He removed Bligh's right shoe. The steel support bore fresh scratches matching the salver. Inside the heel was a cavity containing green wax, a mirror-cut seal, and powdered cyanide. Julian whispered, Why? Because, said Wimsey. Mr. Bligh drafted more than wills. He drafted identities. From the passage came another voice. Then let him draft his own confession. An old man entered, stooped and scarred, but unmistakably the man in the photograph. Honoria stared at him. Adrian Vale looked only at Bligh. You should have killed me at Albion, he said. Bligh's composure broke, and for the first time, Wimsey's amused expression disappeared into something colder than anger. Bligh's face collapsed inward, as though some supporting wire had been cut. You are dead, he said. Legally, replied Adrian. Your profession has always preferred paper to flesh. Murbles closed the door. You will explain everything. No, said Wimsey. Mr. Bligh will explain only what he believes we cannot prove. I shall spare him the effort. He took the forged will from the desk. Septimus summoned Adrian through the tunnel at 9:40. He intended neither confession nor reconciliation, but another bargain. He had learned that Bligh possessed the original Albion records and meant to purchase them with the new will. Julian started. Purchase them with my inheritance? With your obedience. Septimus left you everything because Mr. Bligh had persuaded him that Honoria's legitimacy could be challenged. The clause was bait, not affection. Bligh recovered a fragment of composure. Speculation. Chronology, said Wimsey. Adrian entered the church tower before 10. Baines rang the delayed library bell, establishing a false impression that Septimus remained here. Meanwhile, Septimus crossed the tunnel, met Adrian in the chapel, and drank port from the crested glass. Honoria whispered, My father poisoned him? No, the port was harmless. Septimus returned alive, carrying the glass. Mr. Bly waited in the portrait recess. Wimsey held up the plain tumbler. You had placed cyanide in water. Septimus entered, angry and thirsty after climbing the passage. He drank, collapsed, and you exchanged the glasses. Then you carried the decanter and crested glass underground, dropped the key into his hand, and locked the passage panel from within. Murbles frowned. But the library doors? Already locked by Septimus before he left. He departed through the portrait recess and returned by the same way. Adrian's scarred hands clenched. Bly watched us quarrel, and heard enough to know that Septimus meant to expose Albion. That threatened you, because you were not merely the family solicitor. Your father was Albion's medical superintendent. Bly sprang toward the fire. Julian caught him. The forged will fell, and from its lining slipped a narrow packet of browned papers. Adrian seized them. "The patient ledgers!" "There is your motive," said Wimsey. "Not inheritance, but annihilation of evidence. The theatricals blamed Honoria, frightened Baines, discredited Adrian, and encouraged the police to arrest Cray." Bly laughed breathlessly. "Still no witness." The library bell rang once. From behind the curtain emerged Elsie Marr. "I saw him come from the portrait after Mr. Vane screamed," she said. "He paid me to keep silent." Bly turned upon her with such hatred that Murbles stepped between them. Wimsey looked tired rather than triumphant. "One should never purchase silence from servants," he remarked. "They understand the market far better than gentlemen." As Murbles fastened the handcuffs, Bly glanced at Adrian and smiled. "You have forgotten the second ledger." Adrian went still. Wimsey's eyes moved to Julian, who had quietly backed against the door. In his hand was the green seal. "Ah," said Wimsey, "there is always a final footnote, and usually a relative anxious to suppress it permanently." Julian did not move. The green seal lay between his fingers like a small poisonous jewel. "Put it down," said Murbles. Julian smiled. "Inspector, you have arrested your murderer. Must every family indiscretion become a public entertainment?" "Only those accompanied by cyanide," said Wimsey. Adrian stepped forward. "Where is the second ledger?" "Safe." "That word," Wimsey observed, "has ruined more people than danger." Julian's eyes flicked toward the fire. It was enough. Murbles crossed the room, but Julian flung the seal into the flames and overturned the coal scuttle. Sparks scattered across the carpet. Honoria smothered them with the hearthrug, while Baines blocked the door. The seal survived, blackened but legible. "Poor theater," said Wimsey. "Bly had better scenery." Julian's composure cracked. "You know nothing. I know that your mother copied the Albion dental records before the fire. I know she discovered that several supposed patients were inconvenient heirs, wives and business partners confined under false names. I know she blackmailed Septimus for years." Adrian stared at him. "Your mother? She protected me. She protected herself," said Wimsey. "And after her death, Julian inherited both the papers and the income they produced." Bly laughed from beside Murbles. "Tell them about the names." Julian lunged, but the inspector caught his arm. Wimsey unfolded the browned packet. Its numbered pages skipped from 47 to 62. The missing leaves form the second ledger, not medical evidence, but payments. Who paid Albion, whom they wished removed, and what became of the estates? Honoria looked at Julian with horror. "You continued the blackmail." "I collected debts. From children of the guilty. From beneficiaries. An elegant distinction," said Wimsey, "and entirely without moral value." Adrian demanded the ledger again. Julian refused. Then Baines struck the wall twice. A hollow answer came from behind Lady Agnes's portrait. Murbles opened the recess. Inside stood a narrow metal dispatch box, newly dusted except for one clean thumbprint. Julian sagged. The key in Septimus's dead hand fitted it. Within lay the missing pages, letters from Bly, and a statement signed by Septimus. It confessed the fraudulent confinements, named every trustee, and declared Honoria Adrian's lawful daughter. She read the final line silently. Julian whispered, "He meant to publish it?" "At noon today," said Wimsey. "Which gave Bly one motive to kill him, and you another motive to steal the confession." "But I did not kill him." "No," said Wimsey. "You merely moved the body." The room became utterly still. Wimsey pointed to the pale chalk on Julian's cuff. "Septimus died beside the chapel stair. Bly poisoned him there. You found them, frightened Bly away, and carried your uncle back through the passage to preserve the will that enriched you. The locked room illusion was yours, not Bly's." Julian's mouth opened. From the corridor came the sound of a revolver being cocked. Adrian turned toward the door. A woman's voice said, "That is nearly correct, Lord Peter, but my son carried no corpse alone, and neither of you knows who died." The woman entered wearing traveling black and holding the revolver with practiced steadiness. Julian whispered, "Mother." Mrs. Celia Vale had supposedly died 6 years earlier in Florence. Death, Wimsey reflected, had become deplorably informal at the White House. Adrian stared at her. "You were at Albion." "I kept the records," she said. "And I kept you alive. By selling the names of the imprisoned? By buying silence where I could." Bly laughed. She bought rather more than silence. Celia's pistol shifted towards him. Wimsey stepped between them. "Don't. Murder is such an exhausting method of punctuation." Her hand trembled. He continued gently. "The man in the library was Septimus. Dr. Latham's examination proves that. But the man who first collapsed in the chapel was not." Adrian understood first. "A substitute, Baines," said Wimsey, "helped Septimus disguise himself as you for the meeting. Septimus feared Bly and wished to discover whether the solicitor would betray himself. The veiled figure, the false photograph, even the bells were part of Septimus's own trap." Baines lowered his eyes. "Bly poisoned the crested glass, believing Adrian would drink. Instead, Septimus, dressed as Adrian, took it. Julian found him dying and carried him back to the library, hoping the forged will would stand. Celia assisted him through the passage. Julian said hoarsely, "I thought he was already dead." "He was," said Wimsey, "but your mother then placed the plain glass beside him, removed the decanter, and sealed the room's appearance. That made her an accessory after the fact, not a murderess." Celia's revolver lowered. "And Adrian?" asked Honoria. "In the church tower, as Baines said." He heard the bells fail, descended by the outer stair, and hid when he saw Bly flee. Every witness told part of the truth. The confusion arose because 3 men wore the same greatcoat, 2 used the tunnel, and nearly everyone had arranged some private deception. Murbles took the pistol from Celia. Bly's face had become gray. "You still cannot prove I prepared the poison." Elsie produced a pharmacy packet from her apron. "He dropped this behind the portrait." Wimsey examined the chemist's label and sighed. "Vanity, Mr. Bly. You preserved every prop because you wished the audience to admire the performance." By dawn, Bly had signed a statement. Julian and Celia were charged with obstruction and concealment. The surviving Albion papers went to the authorities. Adrian acknowledged Honoria publicly, though their first embrace was awkward enough to be genuine. As Wimsey departed, Murbles glanced back at the White House. "What did the house know then?" "Everything," said Wimsey. "Houses generally do. The difficulty is that they give evidence through doors, dust, echoes, and servants. And people?" "People," said Wimsey, stepping into the car, "mostly give evidence against themselves." Below the ridge, the sea brightened beneath a colorless sunrise, washing the village clean without improving its morals by one whit whatsoever. St. Olave's clock began to strike correctly. It was, Lord Peter observed, the least believable event of the entire affair.